The landman from Meridian Basin Resources came to Faye Darrow's door on a Tuesday in March of 2013, and she let him in, and she listened to everything he said, and at the end of it she told him the farm was not for sale. She thanked him for driving out. She walked him to the door. He paused at the threshold. He turned back and looked at her. A woman of 71, alone on 320 acres of red Garfield County soil, 8 years a widow, no sons, and he did the thing that men do when they are certain the situation will eventually resolve itself in their favor. He smiled. And then Dale Heston drove back to Oklahoma City, and that was the first mistake he made of several, and it was not the worst one. There's something about a person who doesn't have to prove anything. If you know what I mean, you'll know why this story is worth your time. Hit subscribe and stay with us. Garfield County, Oklahoma sits in the flat north-central part of the state. Wheat and oil country both. The kind of place where the grain elevator and the pump jack have been neighbors long enough that neither one pays the other much attention. The county seat is Enid, a modest town of brick downtown buildings, and a grain trade that goes back to the 1890s land run. And beyond Enid, the county opens into section roads and half sections of winter wheat and working cattle, and the occasional pump jack that has been nodding steadily at the same formation since the 1940s. In 2012 and 2013, the Mississippian lime play had drawn serious money into the county. The Mississippian is a carbonate formation that sits about a mile underground across a broad band of northern Oklahoma. And by that point, the horizontal drilling technology existed to pull oil and gas from it at rates that made the economics work. Operators were running seismic surveys, filing pooling applications with the Oklahoma Corporation Commission, and sending their land departments out ahead of the drill bits to lock up surface rights and mineral leases before the neighboring operators could get there. Meridian Basin Resources, a mid-sized company out of Oklahoma City, had identified a cluster of productive wellbore targets in the northwest corner of the county and had begun assembling an acquisition area, quietly and methodically, in the summer of 2012. Roy Greer had been Garfield County clerk for 22 years by then. He had seen acquisition campaigns before. The county had gone through oil booms, and he knew what they looked like in the deed records. The same landman's name on a dozen filings in the same week. The same corporate entity taking title on parcels spread across the same township. The systematic quality of it. Starting in late 2012, he noticed a pattern in the deed transfers and mineral lease filings coming through his office that had that same systematic feel. He noticed the filings. He read the documents as they came through. He said nothing to anyone about what he had read. That was his nature. He kept his own counsel. He filed his documents and went home. The 320-acre Darrow farm sat near the center of what Meridian Basin had identified as its primary spacing unit. Not at the edge, near the center. And Faye Darrow, who had farmed that ground alone for 8 years since Chet died, and who kept a winter wheat rotation on the north half and 40 head of Black Angus on the south pasture, and her own set of books in a ledger on the kitchen table, was not selling. She was 71 years old. Not young. Not a woman with lawyers on retainer or connections to the state capitol or anything that would suggest to a professional landman that she was prepared to be a serious obstacle. Dale Heston had acquired surface and mineral rights from dozens of landowners across 4 Oklahoma counties in his career. He knew what widows on small farms usually did when a company with real money came to the table. They negotiated. They delayed. They eventually signed. He came back a second time in June of 2013 with a higher number. She said the farm was not for sale. He came back a third time in October with a letter on company letterhead and a senior acquisitions manager in the passenger seat. and a presentation about how the surrounding landowners were cooperating, and how the operation would be carefully managed, and how this was really an opportunity she was unlikely to see again on terms this favorable. She read the letter. She thanked both men. She said the farm was not for sale. Between the second and third visit, she had made one phone call. She had called an attorney in Enid named Patricia Weil, who did oil and gas title work, and told her what was happening. Patricia had reviewed the abstract on the farm. She had called Fay back within the week. Neither of them said anything further to Meridian Basin or its landmen or its senior acquisitions managers for the next 2 years. They just waited. The company kept buying. Through the first half of 2014, Meridian Basin acquired the remaining parcels on 3 sides of the Darrow farm and along the county road on the 4th. By July of 2014, they held surface and mineral rights on 6,220 acres surrounding Phase 320 on every approach. They had spent, by one estimate that made its way through the county in the years that followed, somewhere between $14 and $18 million on the acquisition total. They had drilling permits pending with the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. They had a rig contractor on standby. They had investors watching the calendar. They sent one more letter to Fay in September of 2014. It was the last one. She read it, filed it in a folder Patricia had labeled Meridian Basin, and did not respond. Roy Greer, processing deed transfers at the county clerk's office that fall, could see on paper what the acquisition area looked like. 6,000 acres of surface and mineral rights surrounding a single 320-acre parcel. The pattern was obvious to anyone reading the filings. He understood what the company intended. He understood, as well, what they had apparently not yet understood. He went home that evening and did not say anything to anyone. Chet Darrow had spent 34 years as a land abstractor at a title company in Enid, from 1969 until he retired in 2003, and he knew the Garfield County deed records the way other men know the ground behind their house. Every boundary, every conveyance, every clause, buried 3 owners back in a document nobody had looked at in 40 years. He died in 2005. Before he died, he had explained one thing to Fay about the farm that he wanted her to keep in mind if anyone ever came around wanting to buy the surrounding land. He explained it once, clearly, in a way she did not forget. He told her that in 1952, when his father Glenn had sold the 6,240 surrounding acres, but kept the homestead, the attorney who drafted the deed of conveyance had put a covenant in it, a restriction running with the land, binding on all subsequent owners of the sold parcels. No industrial surface use, specifically including oil and gas operations, without written consent of the holder of the retained homestead. He told her, "Just know what you have." She had known what she had since 2005. She had known it more precisely since Patricia Weil confirmed it in her review of the abstract in the spring of 2013 and told her the covenant language was on page 341 of the chain of title. Here is what was on page 341. In September of 1952, a Garfield County attorney named Harmon Wells drafted the deed by which Glenn Darrow conveyed 240 acres of the original Darrow homestead allotment to a buyer from Wichita, retaining the 320-acre core where the house, the barn, and the original improvements stood. Harmon Wells was a careful man with language, in a way that not every rural attorney of that era was, and Glenn Darrow had told him, when they sat down to draft the document, that he wanted the home place protected. He didn't want oil rigs on his fence lines. He didn't want the ground around him torn up without his say-so. Harmon Wells had written it in the language of a properly structured restrictive covenant touching and concerning the land, binding on successors and assigns, running with the conveyed parcels in perpetuity. No industrial surface use, specifically including but not limited to oil and gas exploration, drilling and production activities, shall occur on the conveyed tracts without the prior written consent of the holder of the retained homestead parcel, their heirs or assigns. It had sat on page 341 for 63 years. In the oil leasing boom of 2012 and 2013, Meridian Basin's land department had done what land departments do. They had obtained title reports on each parcel they intended to acquire, and those title reports had shown clear ownership and no encumbrances that the company's attorneys had flagged as material obstacles. The covenant was in the chain of title, as it had always been. It appeared in the abstract. It had appeared in every abstract on the surrounding parcels since 1952. It is not clear, and Roy Greer said later that he did not know and did not speculate exactly how the company's title review had missed it. It had been in the record the entire time, available to anyone who looked. What is clear is that they had bought 6,220 acres without fully reading page 341, and that this was the worst mistake Dale Heston made in Garfield County. Meridian Basin's drilling attorney ran a comprehensive title abstract on the primary spacing unit in the fall of 2015. He was required to. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission's permitting process for a multi-well horizontal drilling program requires clean title on the spacing unit before operations can proceed at scale. He began the abstract review in September. By the third week of October, he had reached page 341. He read the covenant once. He read it a second time. He set the abstract on his desk in Oklahoma City and sat there. Then he called the company's vice president of land. The call lasted 14 minutes. A second call went to the company president before the end of that day. A third call, sometime the following week, went to outside litigation counsel in Tulsa, who reviewed the covenant language and the chain of title in its entirety and gave the company an opinion. The opinion was that the covenant was valid, properly structured in 1952 under Oklahoma law, binding on all successors and assigns of the conveyed parcels, not extinguished by any subsequent conveyance, not superseded by any later document. Meridian Basin Resources had acquired 6,220 acres of surface and mineral rights in Garfield County, Oklahoma, and under the terms of a restrictive covenant drafted by a careful attorney 63 years earlier, they could not break ground on any of it for oil and gas operations without Faye Darrow's written consent. Without her written consent, the $14 to $18 million sitting in those leases sat in the ground. Patricia Wheel received a call from Meridian Basin's land department in November of 2015. She had been expecting it for some time. She told the caller she would convey the inquiry to her client. She called Faye. Faye said she was available to discuss the matter at a time of her convenience. Patricia communicated this to the company. A meeting was scheduled for December. 3 people attended on Faye's side: Faye, Patricia, and a mineral rights valuation consultant Patricia had retained from a firm in Tulsa who had spent 20 years pricing exactly this kind of asset. Meridian Basin sent 4, a vice president of land, 2 attorneys, and a man whose title Faye never caught and didn't ask about. They sat at a conference table in Enid on a Tuesday morning in December of 2015. Faye said very little. She had said very little for 2.5 years, and there was no reason to change that now. Patricia spoke for her, and the consultant provided the numbers, and the meeting ran 2 hours and 20 minutes and reached no conclusion. The second meeting lasted 3 hours. The third was shorter. Faye attended all 3. She listened carefully. She asked 2 questions across the 3 meetings, both of them factual, and Patricia answered the questions that were directed at Faye before Faye could speak. That was the arrangement. It worked. The final terms took 4 months to finalize. The settlement was sealed under a confidentiality agreement, and Faye has not discussed the amount publicly before or since. What circulated later, through the county, through the coffee counters in Enid, through the particular efficiency with which legal information moves in a small city legal community, was a number somewhere north of $3. $1 million, paid to Faye Darrow in exchange for her written consent to surface operations on the acquired parcels and a royalty interest on production from the primary spacing unit. $3.1 million. For something they had spent $14 to $18 million acquiring without noticing they needed. She had not called a press conference. She had not threatened a lawsuit. She had not hired a lobbyist or complained to the county commissioners or written a letter to the state legislature. She had served Dale Heston coffee the first time he came to her door in March of 2013, and she had declined his offer. And she had waited for the people who bought 6,220 acres without reading to the bottom of the chain of title to understand what that meant. It took them 2 years and 7 months. Roy Greer drove past the first well site on a county road in the spring of 2016, not long after the rigs went up. He had retired from the county clerk's office by then. He pulled over on the section road and watched a Caterpillar scraper working the location pad in the morning light, and a line of Kenworth tanker trucks sitting on the lease road waiting their turn, and the first sections of the drilling rig being assembled against the flat Oklahoma sky. He watched it for a while. He thought about a deed filed in September of 1952 by a careful attorney named Harmon Wells and an old man named Glenn Darrow, who had told the attorney he wanted his home place protected. He had a neighbor who had sold surface rights to Meridian Basin in 2014 and gotten what the neighbor described as fair money. He had another neighbor drawing mineral royalty checks from the same company. He did not know the exact terms of Faye Darrow's settlement, and he did not ask about it, and he did not intend to. He knew enough. He drove on. The wells came in over the summer of 2016. 3 horizontal well bores into the Mississippian Lime, the same formation Meridian Basin had staked its acquisition on. The initial production rates were solid. The company reported them publicly in their filings with the Corporation Commission. The drilling program was called a success. Faye's royalty checks started arriving in August. Faye Darrow is 83 now. She still keeps the 320 acres. The Black Angus herd on the south pasture is smaller than it was, and her younger daughter manages most of the day-to-day operations. But the winter wheat goes in every October and comes off every June, and the farm keeps going the way it has kept going since Glenn Darrow broke that ground in 1921 and decided this was where his family would stay. She has not spoken publicly about the settlement. She has not given interviews. She does not have a social media presence, and her name appears exactly once in any public record connected to the Meridian Basin matter, a consent and surface use agreement filed in the Garfield County Clerk's records on April 14, 2016, signed in her careful handwriting. Norma Fitch had been a notary at the First National Bank of Enid for 31 years and had notarized more oil and gas documents than she could estimate. She notarized Faye's signature on that consent agreement and said later, to someone who asked, that it was the quietest closing she had ever sat through. Faye had signed each page, capped the pen, thanked her without making anything of it, and walked out to her truck. Roy Greer was asked once, at a Garfield County Farmers Cooperative meeting, whether he believed Faye Darrow had known about the covenant from the beginning, from that first March morning in 2013 when Dale Heston came to her door and she offered him coffee and told him the farm was not for sale. Roy thought about it. He said he believed she had known since at least the spring of 2013, when Patricia Weil had confirmed the covenant was on page 341. He thought she had probably known, in the general way that Chet Darrow's widow would have known such a thing, for considerably longer than that. Someone at the table asked why she hadn't simply told the company about the covenant at the outset. Saved everyone the years of back and forth. Roy picked up his coffee. He thought about Chet Darrow, who had spent 34 years reading every line of every deed in Garfield County, and who had understood what very few people understood about the value of saying less than you know. She didn't need to tell them anything, Roy said. That was the point. The 1952 deed sits in the Garfield County deed records, where it has always sat. It is available to anyone who looks. It has been available to anyone who looked for 73 years. Some documents wait a long time for the moment, when what they say becomes worth something. They are patient. And the people who know what they hold are patient too.